Hello, Mr. Queenan.
Hello.
Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. And could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what exactly you do?
I'm a journalist. Well, I'm a journalist and a satirist. I write funny stories. So I write a column every week for the Wall Street Journal on Saturday about anything that I want. And I write for The Guardian in England. I write about movies, and I've written for like all the major newspapers and magazines, and I've written about 10 books. And I do stuff on the BBC, radio stuff, and I've written for GQ, you know, all the big magazines, Time, Newsweek. And, but I've been a freelance writer for 28 years, since 1989. I live over in Tarrytown. I have an office over there, and that's what I do for a living. Support myself. I've always hated the idea of going to work. That's why I became a writer. I hate being in an office. I hate meetings. I hate bosses. So as soon as I could become a self-employed person, that's why I did it. And if I couldn't be a self-employed writer, I think I'd be like an Uber driver or a hitman or something, but I would just never, ever work in an office. If you can avoid working in an office, that's like the worst thing in the world to me. Because the great thing about being self-employed is like on a day like this, I'm done by noon. I'm not staying in the office all day. I'm just getting out. If it's rainy, I'll stay in the office all day, but other than that. So that's what I do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ask the question. Do you have a question?
Where did you go to school? Where are you in school?
I'm going to be a senior in college.
Where?
Towson University.
Where?
Baltimore. It's Towson University in
Oh,
Baltimore.
yeah. My daughter lived in Baltimore for a year. She lived down by the river. Nice. Okay, next question.
What was the defining moment of your career?
The defining moment of my career was I was working for Forbes magazine in 1989, and I hated it. And one day I came home in December, and I had little kids. My daughter was 6, my son was 3, I think, and they weren't there, and my wife wasn't there. And they came in at about 8:30, and I was like, where were you guys? And they said, we were over at the Greenburgh Public Library. We went over to see 101 Dalmatians. And I said, oh, I would really like to go see 101 Dalmatians. And I quit my job the next day because I wanted to see my kids grow up, and I wanted to be a freelancer. I didn't want to work in an office anymore. And I did that. And I still haven't seen 101 Dalmatians. That was like 28 years ago. But I'm really glad I quit my job because I really do like being self-employed. The great thing about being self-employed is if things go wrong, it's your fault. So you're just like, yeah, I messed up. And it's not like in another job where you're trying to blame other people or you're making excuses or something like that. That's the great thing about being self-employed. And then you can simply say, well, I'll work a 40-hour week, but instead of working 9 till 5, I'll work like 7 in the morning till 2. I won't take lunch. So I think that was the defining moment, definitely. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Angel. My question is, why do you enjoy writing satire?
Well, people are ridiculous, and you can just make fun of people, and it's very therapeutic. Like, I'll give you an example. The story I just wrote for this week's paper is about Kid Rock and The Rock, and Caitlyn Jenner are talking about running for public office. The Kid Rock running for, like, the Senate is absurd, okay? The Rock, I don't know. Seems like a nice guy. Caitlyn Jenner, I'm not going to make any comments about that. But I just thought, well, what if you did it the other way around? And politicians said, no, we want to be rock stars. So, like, what if, like, Nancy Pelosi wanted to be in Metallica, Or what if you want to see Elizabeth Warren, like, dressed in Beyonce's clothes, or, like, doing Lady Gaga? I mean, because it's fair is fair. It's like, turn it around. You should be able to do it the same way. Or, like, what's her name? Collins. Susan Collins, the one from Maine, the senator from Maine. If she was in Game of Thrones, that'd be pretty scary. So it's just, it's like you see something and you're like, oh, that's so stupid, Kid Rock, come on. And then you write about it. But the other thing that's really interesting about it is once I write about something, it stops bothering me. So like I'll write about somebody that I really, really hate. Like I hate Newt Gingrich. I just can't stand the guy. I can't stand Chris Christie. I can't stand Jimmy Carter. I just can't stand people with those stupid smiles. I'll write about them. And then people will go, well, why don't you write something nasty about, Newt Gingrich? I did that already. And it doesn't bother me anymore. And it's very therapeutic. And while you're doing it, you're like, oh, this is great. And sometimes they read it. Sometimes, they get upset. Most of the time they don't care. But, every once in a while you'll know that, like, you landed a blow. And they'll respond. So that's, I think, part of it. It's very good therapy.
Hi.
Hi.
Is there a specific impact that you've been trying to make on your readers and through all your many books and articles?
I want them to give me a lot of money. That's what it's all about. Yes, I want them. I'd like it if, my attitude has always been, if you like what I write, that's great. And if you don't like it, that's great too. I don't care. I've always admired athletes because when you talk to athletes off the record and you say, what's it like when you're in the stadium and 50,000 people are going like Jeter sucks? They don't even hear it. They're so totally focused on what they're doing. And also their attitude is, I'm on the field, you're in the stands. I do this for a living, you do nothing. And I think it's the same with writing or with music, is like if people like it and come up and say, I like what you wrote, great, I'm glad you liked it. People come up and say, I hate what you wrote, that's fine, everybody's entitled to your opinion. But I don't really spend that much time wondering what they're going to think about this. Most of the time I just write it. And one thing that's very interesting since the internet started is when I started out writing, if people didn't like something that you wrote, they wrote a letter to the editor. And sometimes you would get the letters. And I kept some of them, and I thought it would be really cool to make a trip across the United States visiting people who threatened you. And just like 10 years later, you'd like knock on their door and you'd go, hey, you wrote a letter 10 years ago. You said, if I was ever in East St. Louis, you're going to jack me up. Here I am. Let's do it. And just to see the look on their face, because they're all like little weenie guys living in their mom's basement, So with the internet, as soon as you write a story, like that story gets published, and 10 seconds later, 15 people have gone online saying, you're stupid, you're a moron, you're a communist, you're a jerk, everybody knows that, and it's just like trolls are just out there, which is one reason why I never engage with readers. When people like go online and comment upon your things, I never engage. It's like, you're entitled to your opinion, that's fine with me, but I don't care. I just don't care. People come up to me and say stuff. People come up sometimes. People very rarely are going to come up and get in your face about something that you wrote. They'll do it anonymously. But, sometimes people will just say, like, I read something that you wrote and I don't agree with it. And you're like, good, that's what makes a horse race. That's fine. That's good, And every once in a while you get a weird call. Like one of the weirdest calls I ever got was a long time, about 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, there was a get-rich-quick convention at the Javits Center that lasted a whole weekend. So they had all these guys who tell you how to get rich, speaking and selling their books. And the keynote speaker was Donald Trump. He was the last speaker. So he came out on Sunday night and he said, none of you guys are going to be rich. He said, you don't get rich by going to something like this. And he just joked about it. So I wrote a story where I said he was the only one at the entire convention who I admired because he told the truth. It's like, you guys are clowns. So Monday morning, he called me. Monday morning, I get this call from this woman. She says, Mr. Trump wants to reach out to you. I said, I've never known what reach out means, that expression, is that, and she said, he wants to talk to you. So I said, okay. So he got on the phone and he said, I liked your story. And then we started talking about the New York Giants because he's a big football fan. And we talked for about 10 minutes. And that was like one of the most interesting experiences I ever had because he's the only president that I think I may have said hello to Ronald Reagan, but he's the only president that I ever had in conversation with however, he was not president at the time. Maybe he'll see this and call. You know, he calls reporters all the time. Like, one of the things that's very interesting, I think, is that when you see things about leaks from the White House, some of those, I think, are coming from him. He really likes to talk to reporters, so he'll, like, call reporters and just talk. He likes to talk. He's you know, he's an unusual guy, but he really does like to talk to reporters. So that's a long way of answering your question. Okay?
Hi, I'm Max. At what point in your life did you discover your passion for writing?
When I was about 4 years old. And I don't, my daughter is a neuroscientist, so she studies the structure of the brain. And she just gave me this book, which is about, it's about how different parts of the brain function. And one of the things that they found is people who have epilepsy or people who have severe migraines, they separate the two hemispheres. They've done it with a few hundred people. And what they find is that the right-hand side of the brain is always constructing a narrative. So if somebody says to you, what made you decide to become a writer? And you go, well, I was Irish, I was poor. So poor people frequently become writers because they don't have anything but words, so they become writers. I was Irish people are storytellers. I grew up around a lot of storytellers. I loved reading books and everything like that. But the left side of your brain, if you say to the left side, why did you become a writer? The left side goes, I don't know. And like, that's the way the brain functions. So I think if I was thinking back on it, I just liked hearing stories when I was a kid, and just I would rewrite stories when I was a little kid, and I was always reading comic books, and my dad was always telling me stories. So I just decided to become a writer at a very, very early age. And I think it's a real gift if you only want to do one thing in life. Like, a lot of people either want to do a million things or they don't know what they want to do. And I really only wanted to be a writer from the time I was a little kid. I wanted to be a priest, but that was mostly because I wanted to get out of my house. I wanted to get away from my house. But even if I had become a priest, I still would have been a writer. And I never wanted to do anything else but become a writer. And one of my best friends never wanted to do anything else but become a painter. So he's the only person that I talk to about work, like talking shop, where it's like all we do is talk about, we get up in the morning and we like to go to work. I just like writing. I just like doing it. And it's not because of like the money that you get or even for the way people react to it. I just like doing it. If people didn't pay me, I would still do it. That could happen too, you know, as you get old, people might stop paying you, but, so that's that.
Where do you get your ideas for your articles?
Out of the air, like literally out of thin air. You know, I read 3 newspapers a day. No, I read 4. I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and I read the Westchester, you know, the Journal News. And a lot of times you just see something in the paper, or sometimes people will just say something. You know, you have to be receptive to, it never does any good to look for ideas. It's always good to just be listening. Somebody just says something, and a lot of times they suggest an idea, and it's always the wrong idea. But there might be something in it that's a good idea. So I just listen to, you know, my kids will tell me stuff. My son will tell me stuff. Like, I'll give you an example. About a year ago, my son is 30 now, and, you know, he likes to play video games, everything, and he likes movies. So he called me up one day, and he said, did you buy me the boxed set of Star Wars, which had just come out with the latest one? What was the last one, Rogue One? Yes. And what was the one before that? The Force Awakens, okay. So they brought out a set that had The Force Awakens, and he said, did you buy it for me? And I said, no. And he said, well, did Mom buy it? I said, Mom doesn't even know what Star Wars is. She wouldn't have any idea even how to do, she doesn't know how to use Amazon, so she didn't buy. I said, why? And he said, because I got the box set, and I didn't order it. And it came today. And then his wife came in, and she said something, and he hung up. And a couple minutes later, he called back, and he said, I'm sorry. He says, you're not going to believe this, but the dogs ordered it. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, the dogs were playing with the joystick. and they had the thing, just press the one button to order things, and the dogs ate the joystick and ordered. He had it open on the screen, and they ordered it. But the best part was when he called Amazon, and he said, "You're not going to believe this, but the dogs ordered it, they ate the joystick," and they go, "Yeah, okay, we'll refund you." And it's like, yeah, that happens all the time. And so I wrote that story, because it was like, that's just a gift. That's just so great. Someone tells you some insane thing, and it's perfect. And then other times, you just have to, like, my stories are due on Tuesday morning, so sometimes, you'll get up Tuesday and you'll just say, "I really need a story idea," and maybe it'll be in the paper, maybe it'll be, on CNN, maybe it'll be on some weird website, something like that. But the ideas just come out of the blue. And I often wonder if there's a finite number of ideas. Like one time when Bob Dylan was young, he was interviewed and somebody said, "How many folk singers are there?" And he said 287. There are 287 folk singers in the world. And like these guys are like writing this down. And I often thought, what if it turns out that there's exactly 4,000 stories in the world? And I've written about 4,000, and one day you wake up and you go, "That's it, no more stories left." And, for some writers, it does happen. A lot of writers just keep writing the same thing. The reason I don't like political writers as a rule is they just keep writing, "I hate Trump, I hate Trump, I hate Trump," and you're like, we get the idea. You don't like Trump. Or, "I hate Nancy Pelosi," or "I hate the Democrats," and it's like, stop, just stop. I've read that story. And political writers will write the same story over and over and over again, and that would just drive me crazy. I don't like going back and writing about the same thing like twice. I don't really like doing it. And then sometimes, I'll give you an example of an idea that just came to me. A lot of times when I go to movies, I get ideas. And one day I went to see John Wick 2, because I'd seen the first one. And I had interviewed Keanu Reeves when he was really young. And I had written a story saying he's going to be famous because he was so incredibly good looking. Not a great actor, as we know, but very good looking. So I went to see John Wick, and John Wick is like, they kill his girlfriend dies, they steal his car, they beat him up. That's okay, but they kill his dog. And then he's like, "I'm going to kill every Russian gangster in the world." And he does. And in John Wick 2, he picks up where he left off, and he starts killing people. So I wrote this story about why is it that John Wick can kill these gangsters so easily? And the answer is, when you get to really, really low unemployment, the mob can't get good help. So like the gangsters that you want, who would be really good with guns, they're gone. So the guys that John Wick is killing are just like losers. So I just wrote this whole story about like explaining through an economic perspective, why John Wick was so successful at killing all these people. And then of course you write the story and people read it and they take it seriously and they're like, "I don't understand what you're talking about. This economic theory is ridiculous." And I'm like, "Guys, it's a joke. Okay, it's a joke." But a lot of people don't get the joke. And that's one of the funniest things when you write some completely ridiculous story and the people don't get the joke. That's great.
He actually already answered my question.
You can ask another one.
Hello. Could you tell us about a time when you were faced with a challenge and like what did you do to overcome it?
That's a good one. Boy, I can't really think. Can I come back to you on that one? Because I can't think of that like right off the. Yeah, I'll tell you what's a challenge is, and you learn this very early when you're a writer. They always say, if you think that you're an alcoholic, you're an alcoholic. If you think just a little bit that you have a problem with alcohol, you're an alcoholic. Well, I've always felt the same way about stories. If someone says, "Hey, would you write a story about such and such a thing?" And you go, "Boy, I got a bad feeling about this story." If you have even a little doubt, don't do it, because it'll just ruin your life for like the next 6 months. When Bob Dylan was turning 50, the New York Times asked me to write a story about him. And I spent a year working on it, and I knew that they would never publish it. and knew that they just wanted a story about how great he was. And I wrote a story about how, like everybody else, in pop music, you're great when you're 20. When you're 30, you're starting to lose it. When you're 40, you're done. And then you just like hang around forever. And that was, to me, that was the story with him. But I just spent like a year working on that story and listening to all his music and interviewing all these people. And I knew that it was not going to work. I knew that that story was not going to publish. So the answer is, if you face a challenge, if you think there's a problem, walk away. If you even suspect that there's a problem, walk away. Don't do it. Because otherwise the worst thing is when you're like agonizing over something and it's like, you know, like when you're in a relationship, right? You're going out with somebody. You know from the beginning, this is completely wrong. Like when I was a teenager, I went out with this girl, and I just wasn't that into her, but I really liked her friend, you know? So it was like, but you couldn't make the classic switch, you know, because it would be disrespectful. And now I wish that I had been disrespectful. I wish that I'd just gone back and said, look, with all due respect, I really like your girlfriend a lot more. And, you know, that's the sort of thing where it's like you're in a relationship and you know it's no good and you know it's going to end badly, and it just goes on and on and on. And it's the same thing professionally. If you get involved in a project. One time I was doing a story about how jazz musicians make a living. And jazz musicians don't make a living. Like if you're Wynton Marsalis, if you're one of the really big stars, you make a living. But if you're a regular jazz musician, you don't make anything. You just make nothing. And so I started interviewing all these jazz musicians. And at a certain point, I got embarrassed because I'm asking them how you make your money. And it's like, well, I don't want anybody asking me that. You know, that's personal. So I worked on that story for about 3 months, and then I just killed it. I just said, I'm not going to write this story. I felt that I was being disrespectful to jazz musicians, but they did tell me interesting things. And one thing that I'll never forget from that story, which I might use at some point, is I talked to this guy who played baritone sax, which is an unusual instrument, you know, really deep. And he told me that he was in 9 different bands. He played in a quartet, he played in a trio, he played in a 9-piece band. And one day he told me that he was coming to New York to play at the Blue Note in a 17-piece band, which meant that he was going to get like one solo in 2 nights because they play like 8 songs a set. So there's 17 musicians. He's going to get one solo. So he comes all the way down from Amherst, Massachusetts at his own expense, and he crashes on his friend's couch, and then he plays for 2 nights with these guys. And then I said to him, how much money did you get? And he said, $100. I said, why'd you do it? He said, these guys can play. And that's why he did it. Just jazz musicians will just say, I play with chumps all the time. If I can play with somebody who can really play, then I'll play. And I think athletes are like that. I think a lot of athletes will just say, like, yeah, they'll say, like, you know, LeBron's down the street. You go, yeah, I'm not going to play with you, but I'll play with him. Or somebody who played professional basketball, if they're around, people will go, yeah, I'll go down and play with. I'll make a special effort to go down and play with that guy. I had a friend, my wife's best friend has 2 sons, and one of them lived in Victoria out in British Columbia, and that's where Steve Nash is from. And he used to play summer ball with Steve Nash. And I said to him, what was it like? He said it was like being in heaven. He said all you had to do was run the court, and Steve Nash would find you, and you would be wide open, because he was like one of the greatest point guards ever. And he said it was just paradise, because Steve Nash just had eyes in the back of his head, and he could just see you wherever you were. That guy's open, here's the ball. All you had to do was put it in the basket. It was great.
What separates your style from other journalists?
Excuse me?
What separates your style from other journalists?
What is what?
What separates your style from other journalists?
Oh, I can write. Most journalists are very good at organizing materials and telling a story, but they're not very stylish. They don't write with any particular. They all sound the same, I think. Most journalists sound the same. So I think that would be one of the differences, definitely.
Going back to Trump, what do you think of the Trump administration and this country as he's running it so far?
I don't think we've ever had any situation like this before. I mean, literally, you know, we've never had a president who had no experience as a politician and no experience in the military. So it's a completely different thing. And the one thing about Trump that I think is interesting is you can say anything you want about politicians, like Paul. People say nasty things about Paul, and he doesn't care because he's a politician and they're just used to it. But Trump takes everything personally, and that people know it. So they'll never stop. Like Saturday Night Live will never stop. The Daily Show will never stop. You know, they will never, ever. I mean, Sean Spicer basically got fired. He's a pathetic loser, let's face it, okay? But he got fired basically because I think Trump felt that he didn't, like, man up when Melissa McCarthy made fun of him. And I'm just thinking, what do you think's going to happen to Huckabee? What do you think's going to happen to her once Saturday Night Live comes back? Because they're going to tear her apart. What do you think's going to happen to Scaramouche? You know, they're just going to go off on him. And, you know, they see a wounded animal and they will just attack it. And most politicians just, you know, they just ignore it. I would love it if Sean Spicer went on Saturday Night Live and did Spicer with Melissa McCarthy. Because I think that would be a way of getting people on his side, because people would say, oh, at least he has a sense of humor. That would be great if he did that. And there's precedent for that. Like Richard Nixon appeared on comedy shows when he was running in 1968, and, you know, other politicians did things like that. I don't know if he's going to do it, but I think that would be great if he did that. But no, we're in a completely different world right now. We've never been in a situation like this before. But the one thing that I do think about Trump, as opposed to other politicians, is politicians know that the public doesn't want them to be in their face all the time. So like George Bush would go home for the weekend. Ronald Reagan would go home for the weekend. Barack Obama would take off. He would go to Camp David or he would go to Martha's Vineyard, and he said, you're not going to hear anything from me for a couple of weeks. And Donald Trump doesn't have an off switch. So he's like a little baby. So you just got to keep like saying, oh my God, what's he doing now? And it's fatiguing. I think it's like emotionally fatiguing for the country to just have a situation where it's like you just every single time. It's like the Boy Scouts, right? What now? You're just going to talk to the Boy Scouts? No, you can't say anything offensive in front of the Boy Scouts. And then he goes down and he does his Boy Scout thing, and it's like, what is wrong with you? Why don't you just like take a day off? Just chill out. But he can't. He just is not temperamentally. He's not temperamentally suited to be a politician because he has a thin skin. And because people know that he's going to have a thin skin, they're never going to stop attacking him. The press will never, ever, 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 ever lay off. They will never lay off because they know that he will respond. And other politicians, Ronald Reagan didn't care what you said about him, and neither did Obama. Obama's attitude was, you don't like me? That's cool. I don't care. Good. I won, you know. I mean, I remember that one thing he said one time where somebody said, John Boehner said, if you pass this health bill, you better be awful lucky. Do you feel lucky? And he said, when your name is Barack Hussein Obama, you always feel lucky. And he just didn't care. He just had a very cool demeanor, and I think that that's relaxing. You know, it's like with your parents. If your parents are always hyperactive and always making noise, it's no good for the kids. And that's what I feel like in the United States is that like the people have to say we have to be calm because everybody in Washington is insane, just crazy, you know. And you just wish that you would just say, hey, you guys have to take a month off, give us a break, you know, like. Imagine if the National Football League lasted 12 months of the year. You just couldn't take it. It would be, first of all, everybody would be dead because, you know, you can't get hit like that. But people would just say, just stop, just go away. Or if baseball lasts 6 months, that's more than enough, you know. But imagine if baseball lasted all year round and you're like, oh no, here we go again, you know, ninth inning, and they're going to walk the pitcher and blah, blah, blah. And that's what it's like with politics. It's like, just stop, give us a break, let us have some air.
Of the major news stories from the last year, which would you have liked to cover the most?
Donald Trump shaking hands with the French president. That was my favorite one, where it's like, Macron knows that he has small hands, and it's like, I am just going to do this like Clint Eastwood thing with him. I'm just, that would have been one I would have liked to have covered. And I would have liked to have been like a fly on the wall when Hillary lost the election, and figure out, like, at what point in that day did she know that she had lost? Because they knew early in the day that they had lost. I remember when Obama ran the second time, that my daughter, who was going to Georgetown at the time, had her picture taken by the Washington Post, and she went and she stood in line for 2 hours so that she could vote in Northern Virginia. And everybody turned out to vote in Northern Virginia and stood in the rain, and that's when Romney knew that he had lost. He thought he was going to win Virginia, and all of a sudden they show him pictures of all these people lined up for blocks to vote against him, and then he knew he had lost early in the day. I assume that Hillary knew early in the day that she had lost Pennsylvania and she'd lost Michigan, and it would have been interesting to be in the room to see, what was the dynamic like, because she was surrounded by people who thought they were smarter than everybody else. She was surrounded by people who just thought, we are so cool. We went to Ivy League schools, we're so smart, and then they lost to Trump, and, not good.
Would you ever consider using social media as a platform to convey your news or your satires?
No, I'm too old. I believe in age-appropriate things. So, like, I don't rollerblade, I don't wear my baseball cap backwards. I just think, like, you should. My kids are always saying that, Dad, you got to start tweeting. It's like, no, I don't want to do it. Because part of it is there's only so many hours in the day, and what I want to do is I want to do my work and put it out there, and then that's it. And the other thing is, I wrote a book about 5 years ago about reading. It was called One for the Books, and it was about how I figured that I had read almost 7,000 books in my life, about 150 books a year. And so I wrote a book just about books. And then there was an excerpt from it in the Wall Street Journal, and it got picked up by people, and they put it on Twitter. And like millions of people read it. But because millions of people read that article, they didn't buy the book. And everybody thinks that if you get more and more publicity, you'll sell more and more books. But if people read the article and figure, well, I get the general idea, they don't buy the book. So even though an awful lot of people read that excerpt, they didn't buy the book. And so that's one of the downsides of social media, is it does reach a tremendous number of people, but it doesn't translate into necessarily what you think that it's going to do. It doesn't necessarily have the effect, because there's too much of it. That's part of it, is there's just too much stuff coming at you all the time. So, no, my kids do that. I mean, my kids will be, one time I said to my daughter, I forget what we were talking about, but she said, what was your philosophy of raising children? And I said, never negotiate with terrorists. And that was like a line that I had stolen from Arlo Guthrie. And the next thing I know, like 10 minutes later, somebody that I know is going, how could you say that about your kids? I said, what are you talking about? He said, you said you should never negotiate with terrorists. I said, how did you know? And, well, so read it on Facebook. And my daughter would just put that stuff on Facebook, just immediately, and it would be, I had no idea that things were happening that quickly. And then there was also the other thing with Facebook that my kids talk about a lot, is they see pictures of like somebody in front of the Washington Monument, and then it turns out that they came to Washington and didn't call and say that they were going to be there, and the kids get really mad. That's one of the things about social media, is people know where you were. all the time. And, you know, you can get caught in some pretty bad situations. But basically, no, I'm just not interested. I don't care. You know, I have enough money, and I don't want to engage with that large a group of people. I'm fine. I mean, I think it's great that people do tweet, and, you know, Facebook's great, but I just don't do any of that stuff.
How do you cope with the stress of like tight deadlines for your projects?
I always get the things done early. In fact, I often think that the reason I was successful was not because they liked my writing, but because I just got things done early. Because when I started writing, the way a lot of people write is they write a pitch letter. So they write a letter saying, this is what I would like to write about. And if you write a pitch letter, people can turn it down. But if you write the story and send it to them, they're much less likely to turn it down because they see what you can do. And they have it there. And editors are always looking for material to stuff into magazines or websites or things like that. So I just developed the habit of just getting the things done really, really early. Like my story doesn't get published till Saturday, and I can still be working on it on Friday, but I finish it on Tuesday. My story yesterday I told them what I was going to write. This morning I wrote it. It's done. I like to get the things done as quickly as possible. Yeah. So that's it. Deadlines are, you know, when you're in high school, you're always going up against you're writing the thing on the bus going to school. And I just got out of that habit a long time ago because I don't like deadlines. I want to have the thing done and then get out. So I just get the things done early.
What is the difference between writing for a newspaper like the Wall Street Journal and writing a book?
Well, here's what's interesting is the article that I write in the Wall Street Journal is about 700 words. So that's about 3 typed pages. So a book is about 300 typed pages. So in theory, that's 100 articles, a book. So in theory, you could write a book in 100 days because it takes about an hour to write an article, okay? But books take a year to write because it's a completely different thing. It's, you know, when you write an article, you take a little idea and you might develop it a tiny bit, but not much more than that. Whereas with a book, there has to be a much bigger theme. And there also have to be parts of it that are different from other parts of it. So it's a much bigger undertaking. It's a lot of work to write a book. I've written 10, and it's a lot of work. And particularly at the end, when you're trying to get it right, you'll be working 16, 17, 18 hours a day for like a month. You won't leave your office. You'll just work all the time. And you never do that when you're writing articles. When you're writing articles, you might spend a couple of hours on the article, but that's about it. Books are really much harder to do.
Hi, Mr. Queenan. I have a question about your writing process. During your writing process, how or when do you decide that what you're writing is really good and you should keep writing, or what you're writing is bad and you should stop?
I never write anything bad. When I was young, for about a year, my wife went to work and I stayed home and I wrote all day long. And I wrote out all the bad stuff. So by the end of that year, I could write. And when I go back and look at stuff that I wrote when I was about 27, and now I'm almost 67, it's pretty much at that same level that you get to a point where you're good and you want to stay at that level. You very rarely get like much, much, much better. But basically you kind of, you know, you hear it. You hear how the thing should go. And that's one of the things that's difficult with dealing with editors sometimes, is that an editor will change something and you'll go, that's wrong, and they'll go, why? And you go, because I can hear it. Like a musician can hear it. It's just, it might not be grammatically wrong, but it's the wrong word, or it's the wrong pacing of the thing. Or like, you'll repeat things, and people will say, well, we compressed that. And you go, no, don't compress it. I'm repeating it for a reason. You know, like when Abraham Lincoln said, government by the people, for the people, blah, blah, blah. Or when he says, you can fool some of the people some of the time, you can fool some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Well, that has a rhythm to it. And one of the ways that you learn to write is by you like literally when I was a kid, I would write out sentences in books by great writers, and literally you're learning how. It's just like I always thought Eric Clapton was not a great guitarist like Jimi Hendrix or Jimmy Page or somebody like that, and that he wasn't original. So what he did was he locked himself in and he memorized all of the great blues riffs so he could just do it and do it and do it and do it. And I think that writing's a lot like that, is that you write out what other people have written, and then you learn how they do it. And then there's certain writers that you can sort of see what they do, and then there's other writers that you're just never going to be able to do that, like William Shakespeare. Don't even bother, he's just off the charts. You just can't do it. But other writers, like lots and lots of writers, like Ernest Hemingway, a lot of sports writers learn to write by reading Ernest Hemingway because he had short sentences that didn't have any adverbs. Just get to the point. And, something that amazes me about other writers is when I read bad writing, I just feel like calling the people up and saying, aren't you ashamed of yourself? Because you used to be good. You used to be able to write a sentence that didn't make me want to puke. And then, like, what happened, And, you don't want to get to that point. But laziness is part of it. A lot of it is laziness. And also when people get older, they get lazy. They just do. It's just a natural part of life, is that when people get older, they just don't work as hard as they used to. My daughter says that all 60-year-old white men should be fired from their jobs across the board, just like get rid of them. And they say, including me? And she goes, well, like you're getting in the way. There's like younger people who would like to have those jobs. And the same with houses. It's like our house in Tarrytown. Our kids grew up in that, and we still have the house. Well, it's a house that should have kids in it, and it's just me and my wife, so we're going to sell the house, We're going to sell the house. I think my daughter thinks she's getting the money. She's not, but, But I sort of understand that, is that people do have to get out of the way. So whenever people my age tell me that they lost their job, and they act surprised, I said, well, didn't you read Death of a Salesman when you were in high school? Because that's what's going to happen to everybody. Everybody gets to the point where it's like, you're done. And it's like, but I'm still good at it. And you go, you're not as good as you used to be. There's a younger person who will do it for a lot less money. And you go, yeah, but I know all this stuff. And it's like, there's a younger person who will do it for a lot less money, and it's time for you to go. And I think that's a truth that's very hard for people to come to terms with.
Hi, my name is Santiago. And what experiences, professionally or personally, have best prepared for your career?
Being rejected when I was young. When I was young, I couldn't get things published. And part of the reason for that is when you're 25, the people that you're submitting your stuff to are 50, and they have a completely different perspective on the world, and they have a different sense of humor. Like when my son's a lawyer, but when my son writes stuff, it's looser than the way I would write stuff because he's a millennial. He writes in a different way, and if he was submitting stuff to me, like he would show me stuff and I would start editing it, and he said, leave it alone. That's the way that I want it. And when I started out writing, I had a lot of trouble because older writers didn't like the way that I was writing and didn't like the way my generation wrote. So you just have to wait until they're gone. And all of a sudden, when I was in my 30s, I started to be successful. And a lot of it was because all the editors were in their 30s. Like when I wrote for Spy magazine, everybody was the same age as me. So we all had the same way of looking at the world. We all had like a common frame of reference. And so when I started out, I was rejected and rejected and rejected and rejected. And then when I got older, and people didn't like what I wrote, I would just say, well, do I get paid? And they would say, yeah. And I would say, as long as I get paid, I don't give a damn what anybody thinks about it. Because I went through things of like, you can't get it published and you can't get it paid. Once you can get it published, you just develop a very thick skin. So if people don't like what you write or disagree with what you write, you don't care because at least it's in print. You know, it's like baseball again. If you play baseball and you go 0 for 5, that's not good, but you went 0 for 5 playing for the Yankees. Guy in the stands is just a guy in the stands, so you don't care.
Did your family and friends support your journalism?
My friends did. My family did not. My mother could never figure out what I did for a living because my mother was blue collar, so to her, everything was you go to a factory and you punch in, and you try to get time and a half, and you try to work double time on Christmas, so you get extra stuff. She could never understand a person who had a job that didn't involve going to the office, so she couldn't get her head around it. My dad more understood what I was doing, so, but the thing is that because my family was blue collar, they just couldn't understand the idea of you have a job that doesn't have a defined career path. So you would say, well, how do you pay for your health insurance? And you go, I pay for it out of my own pocket. And for them, everything would be, no, you get a job and you get health benefits and you get 3 weeks vacation and you get a pension, and any deviation from that just struck them as like stupid. Like, why would you do that? When I was in college, in December, I worked in a bubblegum factory in Philadelphia called Fleur's Bubblegum Factory. I worked there every summer. And one day they came up to me and they said, we would like you to join our management trainee program. And I'm like, I don't want to work in a bubblegum factory the rest of my life. I'm not going to do this. And when I told my dad that, my dad just completely flipped out. He was like, how could you turn down an opportunity like that? I never got an opportunity like that. And it's like, I don't want to work in a bubblegum factory. What, are you too good to work in a bubblegum factory? I don't want to work in a bubblegum factory. That's it. And he could not understand that. So I think a lot of times with working class people, they have a hard time understanding anybody who goes into the arts. You know, if you're working class and you go home and say, I want to be a dancer, they're like, what, are you out of your mind? You know, they have a hard time dealing with that. But my friends were supportive. My friends were kind of amused by my career because all my friends in Philly work for the government. Like, I see my friends all the time. One worked for the IRS, one worked for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, one worked for the VA. And to them, it was like you get out of college, you get a job, you get benefits, you retire at age 62. And they just were always kind of amused that I had this career. And they like it, you know. They think it's great. And I think almost vicariously they participate in it. You know, like they would watch you. I would be on TV and they would go, "Oh, that's my friend Joe. We were in a rock and roll band together." You know, and they would like that. Yeah. So I think people were supportive. My wife was very supportive. My wife just worked until I could make a living as a writer. So she was. I wouldn't have made it without my wife.
All right, well, it looks like that's it.
Do you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Do you have any advice for aspiring journalists?
Yeah. 2 pieces of advice that I have are get out and see people, go out. Don't stay in the office looking at the internet all the time. Like, physically go out, meet people, talk to people, and I think that the other advice that I would give journalists is develop a group of contacts that you can go back to again and again. Because, like, you'll find that when you're working on stories, it's really good to have a few people who know the way things work. So, like, you know, people who can explain how the business community works, or for example, I always wondered how restaurants keep gangsters out. Like, gangsters come into a restaurant and you don't want them there, and how do you keep them out? And I asked a guy one time who ran a restaurant, how do you keep gangsters out? And he said, you get other gangsters to tell the gangsters not to go to that restaurant. He said, basically, that's it. And it's like journalists often have contacts with like criminals, gangsters, politicians. Politicians are gangsters, basically, with Paul obviously being an exception. But it's good to have contacts like that. And then I think the other thing is just to be aware that there's like really unusual. Everybody has a story to tell. I think that that's the most interesting thing about being a journalist is every single person that you meet has a story, and you'll be talking to them, and they're just like boring, you know, and they're talking about their golfing or something like that, and all of a sudden they'll tell you some strange story about like, oh, when I was 16, I worked on a dude ranch in South Dakota or something, and so many people have unusual stories like that. And in fact, it's one of the things that I always thought was unfortunate for my children was when I was growing up, I had really strange jobs. I had a job with a guy who had been on Iwo Jima during the Second World War. He was a Marine. And he had the skull of the first man that he killed in a brown paper bag under the cash register that he would periodically get out, Lieutenant Leto. He would show this skull. And I was like, wow, that's pretty weird, right? And the thing was that you were exposed to this kind of strange world where, you know, people did strange things. Everybody that I knew growing up, the first job they had was like with somebody who was crooked. You know, like they would work for, I had a friend who worked for a record distributing company in Philly, and they would get calls from these guys who would say, we have 10,000 copies of Stevie Wonder's new album, and you can come and get them in a truck in an onion field in South Jersey if you come tonight, but you have to take everything else that's on the truck. And it's like everybody that I knew had jobs like that, whereas my kids had jobs at like CVS. And the thing is that if you worked at a job, like if you worked for somebody who ran their own company, they would have interesting stories to tell, or they would help you in ways. Whereas if you work at McDonald's or you work at CVS, you're not going to learn anything from the manager at CVS. You're just not going to learn anything.
All right, well, it looks like that's it. And on behalf of the 2017 Greenburgh Interns, we'd like to thank you for coming
Good
and talking with us.
questions. Good questions. I enjoyed talking to you. Good luck.
Thank you.